Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome. Our first acknowledgement is that this presentation is prepared for the South-Southwest Mental Health Technology Transfer Center. Our network is under a cooperative agreement from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, otherwise known as SAMHSA. And so the materials here are in the public domain that come out of this session today. We also want you to know that the opinions that will be reflected and expressed during this session do not reflect necessarily the opinions and official position of the Department of Health and Human Services or SAMHSA. Our space has been a space that creates inclusive, equitable, and respectful interactions. And so we invite you to this space today, and we encourage the use of affirming language, language that is strength-based, as you can see, person-first language that's free of labels, inclusive and accepting diverse cultures, and genders, and identifications of all kinds. We want to make sure that we're also being respectful, clear, and understandable in our exchanges with each other. In short, we want to be kind to each other. And we, to that end, we create this normative environment. We want you to share in these values and help us to bring this to life. We do have a code of conduct in all of our sessions, and to that end, bringing together people of all experiences, all intersectionalities. Everyone is welcomed in this space today. And so we want to make sure that we live up to the values I've just mentioned and shared. If for some reason we have to pause, stop, or even terminate this session, we will make contact with you on the back end. We will tell you what next steps will look like, and you will receive information from us, the MHTTC, the same way you did when you received your invite to this session today. Quick housekeeping items. This is a secure space. We've done everything in our power to do so, but as I said before, if we have to stop this presentation, we'll follow up with you. You are muted and you cannot share video. If you have questions, please use the Q&A. If in fact you have any kind of comments, we encourage that sharing. Use the chat. We will be providing certificates of attendance and CEUs for those that will be participating. Because this is a Friday session, we will not begin post-production activities before next week. So it's going to take a little bit more than a week before you'll get any of that kind of attendance or certification information. That also is the same as our videos. Once they go through those post-production, you'll be able to receive both videos and webinar materials on our website, and as well as send your certificates. At the end of the session, please fill out our survey. You'll have information on the surveys, and we'll talk to you about what that looks like as well. The MHTTC is a national network, and so this presentation is being brought to you out of Region 6, out of the University of Texas at Austin. We are the South-Southwest MHTTC. We are so glad. I want to welcome you once again. We are so glad to be bringing you our 4th session. It's our final session of the Cultural Formulation Interview, a collaborative storytelling approach to clinical care. And today's session is named Working with Families with the Cultural Formulation Interview. Our presenter is Dr. Cécile Rousseau. Dr. Cécile Rousseau is professor in the Division of Social and Cultural Psychology at McGill University, and is also, she received her training in medicine and psychiatry at the University of Sherbrooke, Université de Montréal, and McGill. She has worked extensively with immigrant and refugee communities, developing specific school-based interventions and leading policy-oriented research. Presently, her research focuses on intervention and prevention programs to address violent radicalization. During the COVID-19 pandemic, she led a wide community intervention program and conducted a number of research projects on the mental health consequences of this context on Canadian communities. We are very, very honored to have Dr. Rousseau work with us today. I am going to pass off to you, Dr. Cécile. It has been a pleasure to have you. Thank you so much for joining us, and you get to take it away.
Thank you, Mordecai, and it's a real pleasure to be with all of you this morning. Interesting because I'm probably in another country than most of you, so that per se will be a transcultural experience to speak about families. Now, as a researcher, I sometimes speak about facts, and I believe there is a historical truth. As a clinician, I'm much more cautious. And if I totally adhere with Mordecai's suggestion to put respect at the forefront of our exchanges, respect includes dissent. So I'm not going to try to tell you what the truth is about clinical practice with family, but rather to kind of propose a reflection. And I invite you to disagree based on your experience or your background. I think that reflection and intercultural reflection is based on the capacity to dialogue, but also to dissent. So I have no commercial interest to disclose vis-a-vis this presentation. In terms of outline, first, and I will assume that most of you have some knowledge about the Cultural Formulation Interview. If that's not the case, you may ask different questions, but it's because I want to talk about a lot of things and I won't go over what some of you have already seen in the 3 first sessions. So in terms of cultural formulation and family, what is the usefulness of this tool and what are its limits? Second part will be on assessment. So how can the CFI help you to evaluate both individual and families? But individuals always have an internalized family. So a family perspective is interesting, even if you work with one person. And then how can it help us? So kind of some ideas to improve our intervention with families in terms of strengthening clinical alliance, building on family resources, and addressing structural problems. So the Cultural Formulation Interview, just to recap, you have the core Cultural Formulation Interview, which is kind of a concentrate of the kind of information you need to know to put people understand their mental health problem in a cultural context. And it's organized in terms of the subject and the informant modules. And then you remember, you've seen that with Martin Laroche, you have the 12 supplementary modules, but there is no module on family. And so you could say, okay, how will we work family issues with a CFI? Well, family is a transversal dimension in all the modules and in the core CFI. So this has kind of strengths. So the pros is that the notion of family permeates all the key domains of an individual experience. Your identity is, of course, structured around your family history and ancestors, as well as your personal experience. The way you build explanatory model, also coping, help seeking, we can go on and on and on. So all the core issue of the CF5 are kind of linked to family issues. So family is omnipresent in the CFI, but it's not in a single module. So the cons, so the limit of that is that working with family entail layers of complexity which are not modeled in the CFI. And those of you who do family work know that well. So what the CFI will not give you is a clear and simple recipe to work with family. So it's not a way to assess family. These are skills which are complex and which you need to acquire elsewhere. But it provides a tool which can support your family assessment and intervention by making it more culturally sensitive and maybe more respectful, and by providing you alternative tools of intervention. And I think that this is, in fact, very useful. So I work, and this is kind of a balcony in the neighborhood where I work, which is called Park Extension. It's part of Montreal. It is a newly arrived neighborhood, a migrant neighborhood in Montreal, socioeconomically deprived, 60% South Asian, 60% Muslim community. And why, apart from sharing a beautiful image of a balcony, why do I want to share that with you? Well, because it informs the place where I speak to you today. As a clinician, I speak from this particular space, and probably it's what I will say are, and the story I will share are, of course, confidential in terms of the people, but they're all come from this neighborhood. And I just wanted to kind of say, where do they come? Now, the question, if we're speaking together as family, is what is a family for you? Just think for 5 seconds, how would you define a family in your work, in your clinical or research practice? And they are kind of a very large range of family definitions. Usually in Canada, and I imagine in the US, when we do child work or adult work, we tend to mean by family the nuclear family. Of course, for those of you who do family work, you know that a family is much more than a nuclear family with a dad, a mom, and kids, and include various generations, which you may represent through a genogram. So that's the first level of definition of a family. What do you mean? But then you move from the fact that we are here in North America largely in patriarchal society versus matriarchal, which are very rare in the world. And now if you work with people from African descent, you may deal with matrilinear families, which are organized in terms of roles and power very differently from patrilinear families. So I'm not going to give you a course about all these forms. What we need to know is what we don't know and what we should not assume. And my dear colleague, Myrna Lashley, who is from Barbados, always, and at McGill, always tells how in the files, in the files dealing with Caribbean Anglo families in Canada, here, often she finds this little phrase. It is to be noted that these women have kids from different men. And you can feel the judgment and you can feel the kind of disqualification, or the prejudice. So how do we relate to, for example, matriarchal families in which women will have the power and transmit a certain organization of the family and of the structure of the family, and what are our prejudices toward these? Also to be considered is, we often consider that families are organized through blood relation. It's not always the case. And if you work with migrants or in some other communities, people and youth can tell you it's my auntie or it's my brother. And then I get a practitioner telling me, but they lied. This is not their brother. It is their brother, even it's not their blood brother. So how do we consider what are family ties? Are they blood related or emotional? Generational relation in the law, who said that at 18 you're an adult? Well, that's the law. It doesn't mean that is legitimate within a family. Thinking about confidentiality, and that often creates a lot of problem because we reify the legal norms or our own societal norms and apply it to different contexts, and that can be hurtful. And finally, family are evolving, even in the majority, and this is often a source of social tension. So you see how even the definition of family is and has to be taken within a cultural context. Now, in our society, family and societal, there are a lot of burning issues around families. So presently, and that's a cultural issue of majority, gender relation. So how are male-female gender relation changing? Non-binary vision of gender also important. The whole issue of the debate in our society about gender identity and gender orientation are cultural and are creating tension. How does that fit in a cultural formulation about the identity of a family and eventually the different norms within the family around those issues? Of course, children's rights, which are also what do we consider as violence? We, North American society, consider that physical violence, so hitting a child, is always worse than, for example, asking a child to go in his room to reflect. Now, this is not always the case. For some of our African descent families, being isolated in the room may be far worse than kind of a slap from mom. So I'm not advocating for physical, but I'm just saying that all of these are framed culturally, and we tend to have blind spots vis-a-vis this dimension, and they are cultural issues. Use confidentiality, the fact that we North Americans considered autonomy as a core value, and we tend to think that interdependence, core value in, for example, Japanese families, is negatively connotated and considered as enmeshment or fusion. Slogans like zero tolerance for violence are also important and cultural. So yes, gender roles are culturally constructed, and they are important in our assessment of mental health disorders, because we carry, as clinicians, we carry prejudices which are often blind spots. So we carry prejudices which we're not very conscious of in terms of gender issues and in terms of family issues. For example, if in Canada or in Montreal, if a Muslim teen, a girl, comes and say that their parents oppose her dating of a specific boy or oppose her dating boys, there will be the shadow of the crime of honor, which will not be present if it's a white girl who say the same. If migrant kids complain of house chores, the myth of Cinderella will come up. Again, these kind of constructed prejudices toward the other family. Decoding woman's submissiveness or talking about arranged marriage evoke also strong prejudices in majority clinician, which majority has presently their own issue in terms of gender. And you can see the emergence in North America, certainly in Canada, but very much in the US, about discourse around masculinity and linked to white supremacists, so to group who feel they lost their privileges. This is kind of building new types of family which are disturbing for us as clinicians. I don't know if you deal with those families. I certainly do. And this is very disturbing because it's, of course, bringing forward much more prejudice for myself, for example, than the one I could have toward migrant families, to which I tend to be much more close or attentive. So you see, when and what type of family constellation will kind of raise our suspiciousness and maybe interfere with the alliance. And finally, the whole issue, which is very prevalent presently, of gender dysphoria, which we can consider as an distress. This per se is a whole other, but just to see how all of these intervene in what we consider the family is core and what is culturally built in what we assume is a family in terms of child-parent relation and in terms of male-female relation or other gender relation. All of that is cultural and need to be kind of brought to conscious and consider that this can vary when you approach a family. So that was, now I'll move toward assessments and evaluation. Just wanted to see, Mordecai, if there is any comment or question before I move toward evaluation.
No questions in the Q&A as yet, Doctor.
Perfect. So I go forward?
Yes, you may. Please.
Thank you. Good. So how can then, in that context of family, which we have to understand in a cultural context, cultural and social context, how can we use the cultural formulation interview in family assessments, and what is the purpose of it? And I think it can clearly enrich the data collection that we do, and in part, interpretation of these data. So introducing in your assessment the family perspective goes a bit beyond the CFI. If you work with adults, the CFI proposed a patient-informant perspective. So that's a dual perspective. It means you need the patient, and very often you need another person, significant other, close to the person, to have a dual perspective on the patient problem. That will be helpful. Now, if you have a family perspective, you introduce a plural perspective, saying, I need more than two dots. I need more than two persons to understand what's going on and to formulate a plan to solve the problems. So that's what I call a prism assessment, saying, okay, let's add and see whose input we need to understand the problem and to formulate a solution. But then the question is, who should you interview? Okay, because in the CFI perspective, you have a patient, you have an informant. Okay, you have two people which are the available other that you may have. But if you try to understand the family, the question is, who should you interview? Which module and question of the CFI? Remember, you have so much modules and so much questions should you use. If you use all of them, it will be really malpractice because your patient, your family will be exhausted and you will be exhausted. And that's quite violent as a process. So I certainly don't recommend you use everything. But then what? Do you need, for example, some question on identity? I would say most of the cases you do need some question on identity. Do you need some question on explanatory models? Do you need some question on coping or help seeking? Those usually you do need for a family assessment. Now, in some cases, you will say, I need a module on spirituality. You'll see, so you go, I need the module on migration. So you go outside of these key or core issue to look for the information you need, but you have to choose. And the choice is up to your clinical knowledge and clinical intuition. You can begin with something and say, this is informative. and I'll move to something else after. So soreness is impossible and harmful, okay? But complexity is key. CFI do not replace your clinical skills or your clinical judgment. It's a toolbox in which part of the work is to choose a tool. So it's not a toolbox who say you do step 1 and step 2, then step 3. It's a toolbox where all the tools are mixed together and you have to pick and choose. So if you use screwdrivers, you have to know that you need a screwdriver, you need question on identities. This is your choice as a clinician, and you need to prioritize in order to unfold this complexity. And I'll give you a lot of examples about that, which will not teach you how to use a CFI, but maybe give you ideas of how can you pick whether you need a hammer or a screwdriver. So when you choose who you not need to interview in the family, sometimes you cannot have a whole family. Sometimes we can have a whole family in the room. You know, sometimes I invite whole family networks and I have 20 people in the room, and those are fantastic interviews, but it may not be possible. And there are a lot of bad reasons for not reaching out. So you cannot reach to a whole network usually, but among the bad reasons that I would kind of discourage, but are so frequent, is grandfather, oh, he's a key person, you know, in the family. He really takes all the decision, but he's in Africa. Okay, that's not a reason. You can reach to any village in Africa now with cell phones. So reaching out to the diaspora is very important. The fact that the family is not defined by the Canadian or the US border. And you should virtually, and you're able to reach out farther. His wife doesn't speak English, so language is not a reason. Use an interpreter, and certainly not the family. Or age, you know, you can have age-appropriate communication. So maybe just the message is asking, who should I interview, and which module and which aspect may be important are key questions, and there is no recipe for that. Use your clinical knowledge. But the questions which are proposed by the CFI may enrich the things you usually ask. So venture outside of your usual scheduling or questioning domain, and a bit outside of your zone of comfort. You'll see the result will be interesting. So example now about the assessment process, about unfolding identity, which I think is always needed. You know, often people tell me, okay, we are going to meet now a family from Sri Lanka. Good. But that's not an identity. It's a unique identity, which is not enough. You know, Sri Lanka, there is a war in Sri Lanka. So you need to know and Sri Lanka is not an ethnic identity. So is the person Tamil or Sinhalese? Those are the most common ethnic identity in Sri Lanka. So you should go, but it's important because they're in war. And then is a person Hindu? If they're Tamil, it's likely, but it's not sure. Be careful. They may be Christian, or they may be Buddhist, and most Sinhalese are Buddhist. So you see how we often present a family as this is a Chinese family. Okay, but a Chinese from where? What is the background? You may be Chinese and Muslim. You may be Chinese. And so there are these unfolding identity is going beyond this kind of one presentation. Think of yourself. Would you like to be just characterized as an American family? What is an American family? Do you recognize yourself in that? So unfolding identity for a family is important, as it is for an individual. Then the idea of the exploration of significant plural identities. Give you an example. So we meet a family from Rwanda. Rwanda is this kind of single presenting card identity. Now they present themselves as Muslim. And why? This is kind of, it's a minority in Rwanda. Why? Well, the story tells us because it's a mixed Hutu family background, and this had been utterly painful during the genocide and is still a source of divide and hurt in the family and a source of danger for the family members. So the Muslim identity have reconciled this kind of broken identity. So the idea is families are often mixed. You know that in the US, you have an enormous number of mixed families, which are, by the way, not represented in research. We tend to overfocus on kind of global ethnic identity as if they were pure to say, you know, which is not the case often. So the idea that plural identity in families may be very significant in terms of what's happening and in terms of what needs to be addressed and how can you do the trauma work, for example. So intersectionality is dynamic process and it's associated with development. So you see, when you assess a family, your identity module of the CFI is useful to unfold these identities. You may also unfold meaning, explanatory models, which you know is kind of a key piece in the CFI. Just give you an example. Tin, a 6-year-old Chinese boy referred by the school for elective mutism, and with parents which were presented as very compliant, wanting psychological help for what they considered, they agree with the school that this is a disorder. Now, the assessment with the CFI revealed the unspoken transgenerational trauma in the Pol Pot camp. In fact, these parents are not just Chinese, they're Khmer Chinese. And as kids, they survived the Pol Pot camp because they followed their parents' advice, do not speak. And the boy is exactly the age they were in these Pol Pot camps. So silence suddenly takes on a whole different meaning. It is about resilience. It is about unspoken intergenerational trauma. You see, unfolding meaning is very important to intervene. CFI can also help you in terms of family role to understand family relation. So another example is a young Senegalese woman is the third wife of an old uneducated man. And when the clinical team consult us, they assume that the family dysfunction and the tensions comes from a traditional marriage. You know, those people do arranged marriage. So there's a lot of prejudice around marriage. By the way, arranged marriage are do not function better or worse than romantic marriage in spite of our prejudice around that. I'm not advocating for arranged marriage. I just say we have strong prejudice toward romantic marriage and there's no evidence that it's really better. It's just the kind of cultural stuff. It could be, both can be very, very violent and very problematic. But the clinicians assume that. Now, the CFI reveals that this young woman comes from a high status family, that she is educated, that she has family abroad. So what do you think? Well, there is a dissonance because a high status family would not give an educated young girl as a third wife to an old, uneducated man. It doesn't fit. This is not the way arranged marriage functions. So it brings you to the fact that you have to think that there is a family secret. You have to think about it and be very careful because secrets are not to be forced. You have to be very careful before unfolding secrets. What kind of family secret can you think of? You think, you don't guess because you don't know. Well, you can certainly think that maybe the girl had transgressed and the family had married her in order to preserve family honor. That's a possibility. Other think, maybe she's an illegitimate daughter and there is a secret around her own birth, which kind of influence the choice of a husband? You don't know, but you know something is not okay, and you know you don't know about it. You see, you have to work with the gap in the family story. So it's very important to see that our prejudice may obscure our capacity to think clinically about families. Evaluation, so culture is also culture of the majority. And I add a case which is kind of a pure white Canadian little girl, 11-year-old. Mom is pro-vax and is terrified of the COVID virus. Father believes the virus has been invited to control people and is opposed to Roe's vaccination. Grandparents think that I'll let that alone, but you know, it means, and I'm sure you've seen cases like that, if not in your own family, it all becomes so explanatory models around the vaccine become a whole complex issue, and mother is asking your help to take sides. So there's a huge family split. And so we have to look at our bias in this conflict. Are you pro-vax or anti-vax or with doubts, whatever your position? And does that interfere with your capacity to think clinically this situation? Okay, this is important because the answer is not yes or no. The answer is this is a family in distress. This is a little girl which is caught like a tomato in a sandwich. And you need to think clinically what's best for her and for the family. The question is not about the vaccination. The question is about the clinical context of that family, but your own bias may interfere with your capacity to act clinically. You need to be conscious about it. So that was about assessment. Again, Mordecai, I'll just stop to see if there are any comments or questions on assessment before I move toward intervention.
We have no questions at this time, but we'll encourage those of you that have questions. Please put them in the Q&A section for Dr. Cécile. Thank you.
Thank you. And you may have comments also. For example, you may think that what I just said about Rose and her family story is nonsensical, and please do so. I do not pretend to hold the truth. I'm just kind of raising some of the clinical dilemmas we may have. Good. So I talked about how these kind of heterogeneous toolbox that the CFI is, how can you use that in assessment of family or assessment or clinical situation in which you need to think the family piece, because it's usually a big piece of the puzzle. It's rare that family is totally insignificant. If family is absent or dead, it doesn't mean it's insignificant. And an internalized grandmother figure can be as important as the living mother figure. Okay, so how can the CFI be sometimes useful in family intervention? So I propose that it can help you, and maybe you have other ideas for four broad domains in intervention. It may help you to improve alliance and cultural safety of the family you're working. So it's not unique, and CFI is not unique. It's just helping you to explore domains you have not thought of, which can help you to improve the alliance and the cultural safety of the family. Now, you may use other ways to improve cultural safety and the alliance with your family, of course, and other tools. It may help you to mobilize the family and the community strengths, and to choose therapeutic intervention and to adapt them eventually to the family predicament. And finally, it may be helpful to strengthen a multi-actor coordination in a treatment plan. So I would say these, maybe you have other ideas, but usually the CFI, in the way I've used it with family, have been helpful in these broad domains. So let's move toward example. That's an example of an alliance. I call it the Turkish coffee story. It's a story of a little boy, 7-year-old, with ASD, so autism spectrum disorder diagnosis. And the community team come to see me because they say, you know, we've been working with this boy for 2 years. We worked very strong. The mom is not in the picture. There's just a father, probably he's Asperger. We've been working very hard. Dad doesn't want to do anything. He doesn't understand us. He doesn't implement our recommendation. We have a treatment failure and we're close to calling use protection, maybe having this boy placed because it doesn't work and the boy is not developing properly in the school. It's at its end, nothing works. So I just kind of begin exploring, okay, so, but is there a family around this dad and little boy? And they say, oh yes, they live with grandparents. And I said, oh, so you've met the grandparents? And they say, no, they're Turkish and they just speak Turkish. So you see the way in which we don't think family-wise, and they had been working with this family without contacting ever the grandparents for 2 years, in spite of the failure of the intervention. So I said, okay, we're going to meet grandpa and grandma and have an interpreter with the whole family. So grandpa arrived and he's very serious and very patriarchal, and he has a big mustache and he doesn't smile. I present the team, I welcome the family, and they sit down. And then grandfather looked at me with very dark eyes and said, now I need to have coffee. Okay, I have a team of 20 person sit around the room, and I understand that he's hurt because we haven't recognized his role as a patriarch for 2 years. We have bypassed him. So I apologize, saying that the rules of hospitality, so I'm crossing boundaries in terms of the therapeutic space, is that because we're receiving him, we could have offered him coffee. So I said, do you want us to see coffee for you? And he said, no. He said, I want to go at Tim Hortons, so that's 1 block away, and I'll get coffee for all of you. So we have 20 staff there, and going to Tim Hortons and going back is 20 minutes minimum. But this man is hurt, and we have not taken him in account. So I bow to his demand and send one of the team members. They go to Tim Hortons and come back 20 minutes after with 10 coffee. And then we begin talking. And the meeting goes on very well. We take decision, and we involved grandpa and grandma in the treatment plan. And 1 year after, the school contact me and I say, okay, what's not going well? Is there a problem? And they say, no, since grandpa and grandma are involved, everything is going well. We have a successful alliance and it's working well, but we just want to recap with you and with the family. So I said, that's okay, let's meet the family. So that the team gets very excited and say, we have to prepare coffee. And I said, yes, but don't bring it yet. So they prepare coffee, it's smelling coffee. Grandpa comes, he's very serious with his big mustache, sat in front of me. And I bow to him, welcome him, and say, would you like to have some coffee? And then he has his little smile, just smirk on the corner of his mouth. And he said, well, thank you, but today it's not needed. So what is this about? This is about alliance. So this is about how do you repair the fact that we've bypassed the patriarch. And you don't repair by giving him something which is kind of humiliating for a patriarch. He needed, and therewith we are in the gift and counter gift logics that you have in a lot of society. He needed to affirm his patriarchal role by giving us something. And accepting the coffee was a way to say, yes, we recognize you are a patriarch and important for the family. and that established the alliance. So you see, it's about thinking out of the box in terms of definition of the family, definition of the roles in the family, and definition of the cultural elements which establish these roles. Now that was a nice story, but can we have less successful story? Yes, we do. Worked with a Somali adolescent in youth protection. He was placed in a closed facility with a diagnosis. And we really felt that there was a lot of prejudice on the youth protection side because he was a boy and he was Black and he was kind of automatically considered as dangerous, even if he was kind of just a bit more, I would say there was a bit of impulsivity, but we thought the dangerosity risk was kind of increased by the prejudice toward him being a Black boy. So we attempt to uncover the institutional racism, and we flunked. It didn't work. Why? Because we created a split with youth protection, who told us when they flushed us, when the mother will understand that what we want is for the good of her son, she will agree with us. So there was kind of an institutional retaliation. And we had to reflect and to say, having a good alliance with the family is not enough if we cannot protect them. So that's the whole issue of compromise. You know, having a good alliance is good, but you need the multi-actor perspective, and that should be part of your formulation. If you don't have the multi-actor perspective, and if the other actors do not feel included and valued, in spite of the fact that you may critique some of their stance, well, that may not be helpful for the family. Let me move on to an example which evokes intervention per se. So the history of Mohammed. Mohammed is a 15-year-old Ethiopian boy. He was diagnosed with acute psychosis in the emergency department, had been separated from mother from 9 years. He stayed in Somalia with dad, sent to Canada by father as retaliation when mother remarried, had been psychotic for 6 months, so he qualified for at least schizophreniform episode. Mother thought, so that's the explanatory model. Mother thought it was a medical illness. Sister, who also came from Somalia, evoked fierce possession in younger brother. I won't go in detail. Yes. Nope. Back. Okay, so there was, in the case of Mohammed, there was questionable efficacy of neuroleptic. It didn't work. What worked when he was in hospital, he would get better, but because he was far from mom, which he thought of hurting, but medication was not really working. And so with the family, we identified complementary solution, which in fact proved much more effective. So that's about help seeking. So a traditional healer helped to establish a bond with the mother. It was all a ritual, which I won't explain here, which was kind of a way to say your bond with the mother had been severed by the separation. How can you reestablish it to protect both you and the mother? There was a renewal of tie with the father lineage through father twin sister blessing, because we try to contact father, but he wouldn't respond. Going regularly to the mosque with the paternal cousin, building bridges between the two worlds. And this boy, which in fact had cognitive limitation due to early meningitis, got better and sustained the improvement without medication. So it's absolutely not magic nor a plea that neuroleptics are not efficacious. But when you're confronted with treatment failure, you have to think that culture helps, traditional help-seeking pattern and explanatory models of the family may be powerful tools that you should try in intervention, especially if what you usually do is not working. So the appeal is to say the CFI will help you with investigating the explanatory model and the associated help-seeking strategy. And that can lead to a good outcome in some cases. So it's not magic, but it may help. Another example, so a girl that I will call Awa, hospitalized, catatonic picture. So she was a 15-year-old, followed by a psychiatric nurse in OPD. And this is an example. Why I give the example of Awa is because in the case of Awa, we tried to do a CFI when she was hospitalized, and the dad was adamant that this was a medical condition. There were no problem. There was nothing traditional. The family in the country would say nothing different, and so on. So fear of stigma and fear of being seen as this strange or exotic other. So he clearly didn't trust us. And the first thing which established a trust is when he asked a psychiatric nurse, do you have children? He was very worried when she said she was in her 50s, that she didn't have children. Then he looked in her office and saw a photo of her with kids and said, who are these? And she said, those are the kids of my brother, and I care a lot for them. And at that moment, he established a good alliance with him. So it was the whole idea. It's not your nurse identity that I need to know. Are you a respectable woman, and can I entrust you my daughter? And a few months after, he asked me, do you believe in ghosts? Okay, so I personally do not believe in ghosts. I don't say though ghosts do not exist. I don't know. You cannot prove ghosts to exist or not exist. You cannot prove God to exist or not exist. It's a question of belief. So I know ghosts are very important, even if I don't believe. So we had a very good conversation on ghosts. And then things came around. I don't want to go on more with our story, but I wanted to bring it because sometimes you do a CFI or you try to do a cultural formulation at the beginning of the assessment or treatment. Because of trust issue, you will not get anything which you believe is significant and can inform your treatment until a few months after. So the whole idea is this is really a process. You have to think families, you have to think culture with time. In that case, the father told us about the ghost and the traditional etiologies kind of 5 months after the beginning of the treatment. And when I transferred Awa to adult services, it was the last home visit, and she had already linked with adult services. And she told me in confidence, she told me, yes, I went to see the psychiatrist and psychologist. Then she giggled and said, they don't know anything about black magic. They told me I'm bipolar. Of course, I treated her for bipolar and she knew about it. She had the medication and we had told her everything. She told me that, so they told me I'm bipolar. And then she giggled again and said, who cares, And they asked me, why do you want to have treatment in our hospital? And I told them, I want to know more about myself. And then she smiled at me and said, and they told me, this is a very good answer. So you see, this is about our patient knowing perfectly what we expect from them. They decode our professional culture. They know what to answer. It doesn't mean that this is what is more significant to them. So let me finish. So this is in a state during the pandemic and in conditions where there has been a lot of violence. And it's about the violence in our society, which is a cultural issue, both on your side of the border and here increasingly. So Tom is a white Canadian boy referred by the police. That's our culture. He is referred because of racist, misogynist, homophobic, and anti-Semitic online posts. With some of his peers, he have prepared a school shooting plan. That's part of the arrest. Father is unemployed. So here we enter into the family culture, fascinated by World War II and by violence. So you can see the bitterness of dad. So unemployed, poor, and dreaming about heroic war in which you can fight an enemy because you cannot fight the present system, but thinking about glory and heroism. Mother has huge achievement dreams for Tom. He has learning difficulty. So he's caught between the American utopias of, can we be warriors and heroic warriors and great men, and these dreams of mom, self-made men and winners in our society, and the fact that in his school he's a loser and he buy in as a way to compensate into the youth dystopian culture. If I can be nobody, if I can have no voice, then I'll participate to apocalypse. I'll be somebody and you'll hear of me in the negative side. Being a monster is better than being nobody. You see, this is part of our culture, and we should work that also from a cultural perspective. This you can use also the CFI. The CFI is not just for those who you considered as the other, and certainly not for the minority. It could be a great tool to work with majority, with the present dilemma that we have in our own culture, in the way this is affecting directly our youth, the stress and the violence in our society. Just wanted to, and before concluding, to coin my dear friend Elena Laldea. She's a psychologist and psychoanalyst in Argentina, and say power cannot be given, it should be taken. So recognizing family strengths can be a threatening adventure for clinicians, for all of us. We have the fear of losing control, fear of being blamed for innovative practices when we move out of evidence-based, but evidence-based has usually been produced on white majority middle class population. And yet we apply it to everybody, which is per se a problem. It doesn't mean it cannot be useful. I'm not, nothing against evidence-based. I'm just saying that the way we use it is their religious way of using evidence rather than a scientific way, which is on which population has the evidence being produced, what are the limits of this knowledge. We often have also, as clinicians, the fear of transgressing societal premises, and supporting family resources is key to healing and recovery. Conclusion: CFI can be used to support culturally sensitive family evaluation and intervention, but as I tell you repeatedly, it's not a recipe book, and you need family skills on the side. It doesn't replace family intervention training nor your own experience. Weaving the collected information together in a formulation requires both experience and a team. So it's not because you're using the question that you will understand how to weave together the information that you get. So work with people who are used to doing that, consult if needed, and just acknowledge that you don't know when you don't know. We don't have to play apprentice sorcerer, but it's a great way to go. So I really encourage you to go that way. But we have to recognize I'm often ignorant. The more I know about culture, the more I know about the critical realm, the more I realize how ignorant I am. So it may be, and I think it's a useful way to think outside the box when we are confronted with intervention failures. And it really invites us to think, what do I miss or ignore? What do I take for granted? And finally, how can I do things differently? Thank you. I hope you have comments or questions.
And thank you. Yes, there are comments and questions. And so I'll read them off for you at this time. We'll start with some of the comments. Dr. Rousseau, your presentation is wonderful, and I agree, I concur. If others are experiencing this training like me, we are just enjoying your insights. I don't want to interrupt your amazing understanding as you share cultural examples of the use of the CFI. It's so useful. And our first question for you is, what if the child and the family members have conflicting cultural issues? How do we respect each person's opinions and address the needs?
So this is a central question, and it's very, very common. Okay, in the literature, in the migrant and refugee literature, it's often represented as linked to differences in intergenerational acculturation written. And that is a reality. So, for example, you are a family from Guatemalan background and you are living in New York or in Providence, the parents may have either Latino or Mayan views of the world and of gender relation and of parent-child roles, while the kids who have grown up in New York or Providence may and very often will have American views of what is appropriate in terms of home chores, what is appropriate in terms of dating, what is appropriate in terms of independence out of the family. And these are really the bread and butter question. What is very important in those, I would say, very classical situations is to have respect and understanding for both sides. The youth have absolutely the right to define themselves as 100% American. You don't want them to be alienated or rejected by their families. That will be a bad outcome. The families have the right to want to be Guatemalan and not American, and to raise their kids according to their values. And so you're really entered into a mediation negotiation process where you have to think, for this child, is the child either parentified and internalizing and distressed because he cannot be like his peers, American peers, and he's too much in the parental model, and then you're going to try to give and build some space of freedom so that he can go out? Or is he in a rebellion mode in which he provoked and disqualified and hurt his parents, in which case you kind of tilt the balance on the side of the parents, saying, look, you can be American and still respect your parents. So you're trying to build a negotiations part in which, for example, in those cases, you don't want the youth to lose the link to his family and community, nor the link to the mainstream community. And this is always a complex exercise. The other situation which is very frequent is mixed culture families. This is increasingly the case. It's wonderful because it's a source of richness in our family. Now, it leads to some clashes, especially when you have a huge differences between, for example, between Japanese background and let's see, and a Somali background. So you have all kinds of mixed family. I've seen First Nation, so Inuit background with a Turkish background. Now the predicament, the vision of the world are totally different. The notion of respect, the notion between, for example, the Japanese society with the notion of ame, of attachment, values interdependence. So you're loyal to your family up to the end of your life, and you're loyal to the enterprise which employs you up to the end of your. Now, the Somali culture Of course, talking about culture like that, you forgive me. It includes an oversimplification of things, but in the nomadic part of the Somali culture, the people have a level of autonomy and use in particular, which resemble much more the autonomy that you have in North American society, and even more. And this kind of mixed family can bring together in the couple and in the kids a lot of clashes, which you may resolve if you do a genogram and if you work the negotiation of how can the kid belong to both sides, and how sometimes even when the family are separated, how you can resolve the split saying there are tensions and there is a richness. It's really not easy when you have deep clashes. And of course, these days, a lot around gender identification and gender orientation. Again, let's be very careful not to be politically too correct, but to think these differences and clashes clinically.
Our next question reads, this raises issues between mental health and spirituality. How do we maintain appropriate boundaries by recognizing our own limitations in knowledge while still being effective?
This is a key question. Mental health problems have existed since the beginning of humanity. As mental health practitioner, we have to be very humble. We have, in terms of the humanity, very short existence. We've existed maybe in the last century. It doesn't mean everything was perfect before, but societies, individuals have survived and addressed human distress since the beginning of time. And so just like our therapy and our medication and so on are absolutely not perfect and have adverse effects, traditional and spiritual approach may have adverse effects. So I'm not pleading for a romantic approach. I'm really pleading for complementarity. So just in broad terms, and I think that so it's very important to work in complementarity and do not assume that we have all the response. In broad terms, and I'm speaking now like a psychiatrist or shrink, if you think of the psychotic range of disorder, usually medication is important, but spirituality is very often, and tradition is very often a powerful addition to the treatment. So we're speaking of complementarity. Now, when you think of grief and trauma-related problems, and here I refer to the work of Obeyesekere, among others, so the work of culture, very often tradition and collectivity and community have very strong tools. And therapy may add if these tools to address the grief, to address the trauma, to address the collective distress do not work. But we're not first online there. You see, there is, I would distinguish, I will always say spirituality and tradition and culture have an enormous lot to contribute to reestablishment, healing, or soothing of emotional distress. Sometimes, just like our therapy and medication, they may aggravate things. So it's not romantic. In the realm of severe and persistent disorders, psychotic disorder, medication and psychiatric interventions certainly have a place. It doesn't mean that spirituality and culture is not important. In the realm of anxiety, depression, and stress-related disorder, religion, spirituality, and culture and collectivity and art and expression and political action and so on have an enormous role to play, and we have a small role to play. We're taking too much space and underestimating these other resources.
Thank you, Doctor. And our next question reads, I appreciate the therapist's cultural value of including family perspective within the context of intervention for people of all ages. I also realize this is a cultural belief of our discipline as therapists that may not be held by my client. Can you speak to considerations for how to work with an individual who does not want family involved in their care at all, including within information gathering?
So this is key and very, very, very frequent in North America. So both in Canada and I believe in the US, although you may contradict me. So we have, we have constructed our psychology and our models out of and around the independence and autonomy of the individual. This is reflected by the whole trend of having, for example, ego psychology, so constructing the self as independent is core to our society to produce a type of individual achievement-related individual, competitive individual that we need in order to pursue and perpetuate our society. And that leads us to strange cultural practices. For example, babies in North America are usually put in a crib with bars when they're born. That would be considered absolutely cruel and inhuman by, 8/9 of humanity who consider that a baby should be on in mother bed and breast so the co-sleeping is a rule for most of humanity. But this is a cultural practice which is a marker of our status in terms of construction of the individual and the autonomy. So it's normal that in our mental health services, because we've been raised to be autonomous and because the notion of individual autonomy, individual is so important, people don't want their family involved. There is stigma, there is shame, and that is true also in other communities. But there's also this idea that it is my business and it has nothing to do with my family. I think that proposing family work is always important because it kind of put clear what your stance is. Now, people may refuse, and I always leave the door open. Say, I understand, respect your point for the moment. You may change, and I may propose you this at some other point in time. So it's interesting to leave the door open. In a lot of cases, people are adamant at the beginning and they change over time. So just think that it could be a time you should, rather than try to convince the person or do more of the same, try to understand what is the fear, what is the anger, why should we not talk, what and how. And so it's very important because it allows you to have a conversation often about the family and to begin unfolding what the family is like. Now, remember, and some family therapists say it, that you can do family therapy with one person, with one individual, because we all have these internalized figure. So reaching out to the family is better. Think of it in a time perspective. Don't try to force people, try to think of the obstacle with them. And maybe with time, things will unfold. And if not, try still to think the family within the person and their internalization of the family network.
Thank you. Our next question reads, being Black is both considered a race and a culture. However, my experience tells me that our society treats Black more in racial terms. How can practitioners benefit from treating Black as a culture and consider the CFI as a very good tool to be more informed and also remove the prejudices we sometimes carry? Do you have an example that would help us in our understanding?
This is a fascinating question. I'm not sure I'm the best person to answer. I'll tell you what my thoughts are, and certainly not entitled to speak on behalf of Black people. Mordecai can help me. Okay, let's try as an old white woman. I think what you say is very true in the sense that, you have this category of Black as a race. So it really addresses phenotype. And what you're saying, and I think this is kind of particular to the United States, Black American and then Black youth culture is very much of a culture. And what is interesting is how presently in youth, I would say, oh, certainly in Canada too, it's considered cool as a culture and sometimes a problem as a race. So what you're bringing is it's two different universes which interact and may not be considered as such and may not be respected as such because it is linked to music, literature, politics, and a whole vision of the world. And this is important and should be considered. So it's not because when you consider it as a race, you may, and this is a bit of a problem now with equity and diversity and inclusion things, is that difference may be constructed as handicap. I have a problem with that, you know, when in fact it may have been and it may still be a source of suffering and exclusion, and it is and maybe also an immense richness. So distinguishing the two parts is very important. The second reflection that I have about that is about the heterogeneity. You know, just like when I was saying, if you speak of Rwanda, there is a heterogeneity of identities in Rwanda beyond the ethnic divide. Now, if you think of Black as a race, but mainly as a culture, you need to unfold that because there is a heterogeneity. And I'll just give you a clinical example, which was striking. You know, we had a lot of Somali and accompanied minors coming to Canada, and well-meaning people in youth protection who were in charge of finding them foster family would say, okay, we're going to ethnic match them and put them in Black family. And I remember Somali youth that they put in a family from Haitian origin. Now in Haiti, parent-child, parent-youth relation are quite vertical. So intergenerational authority is very vertical, while in Somaliland, so north of Somali, the relation are with the queer, which is a peer group, and a youth is supposed to individuate quite soon. So they assumed that the family and the youth would be closer because they were sharing this Black identity. And in fact, because the Haitian culture was very vertical and the Somali culture much more horizontal in terms of authority and age relation, it was a disaster. It was a total clash. So, so your question is fascinating and huge, but needs a lot of distinction because I would say there are multiple Black culture and certainly a Black American culture. And you're absolutely right. It kind of fades out behind the racial divide, and this has clinical consequences and is not doing justice, I think, to the way we can use it in clinical practice.
So we have about 10 minutes left. We're going to take as many more questions as we possibly can. The next one reads, how do we work with children who are adopted and they're figuring out their current family's culture and their identity at the same time? In the case, their biological family has a different culture / identity.
So adoption is a fascinating realm in which I think the CFI and can be very, very useful. Why? Because very often with family work, we work with genograms. Now, adoption is a very good example of a situation where the genogram may do violence to the child because the genogram will represent the fact that this child has been cut and maybe nothing is known about biological mom and dad. I've seen a lot of cases with kids being adopted from orphanage where that is the case. So the genogram will represent continuity for the adoptive family and rupture for the child. So you'll be careful in using genogram in such cases. Sometimes it's useful, but be very careful. It could be very violent for the adopted child. So the question is, how will this child represent the different cultural universe he can belong to? It's a complex process. You can assume he's totally entitled to revindicate the culture, origin, and identity of his adoptive family. But the environment may not permit him or her to do so. So just imagine, and that's quite frequent. You have a Black kid adopted by a white family. He may revindicate that he's 100% Quebecois, just like Barack Obama can revindicate that he's 100% white. I think kids have the right to revindicate they can 100% all the identities of their parent and their chosen identity. Now, it doesn't mean the environment will recognize him this right, because they will always say, but you're different, but you're Black, but you don't look like your parents. You see how it hurtful. So you have to work with the idea that he can revindicate the identity of the adoptive parents, and simultaneously the identity dreamt or the constructed from the few information he have of his biological parents. And imagine it. What is very interesting there, which I often find, is that in childhood, in spite of adoptive parents' attempts to communicate about the identity, which is usually protective, about the identity of the biological parents and community, the child will often kind of focus on trying to belong in multiple ways to the family of the adoptive, to the identity of the adoptive family. At adolescence, you have usually a reactivation of attachment issue and of identity issue. So adolescence is a key moment. Very often we work with kids by often using the internet. So having sessions to explore and build a fantasy scrapbook or book about what they imagine is their ancestry, and so on, because there is a need to construct this fantasized identity, not only as deprivation, not only as dad and mom abandoned me, not only as I was a product of rape. There is a need to reconnect to something which can be invested. But this is also a big question. And yes, I've just seen in the chat, it is often the case for biracial family, except that there you have much more story to work with that you can weave together.
All right, and our next question, in the interest of time, we'll close out here, is how has your experience been with working with bilingual families or using interpreters while implementing the CFI?
So this is very interesting because most people do not like to work with interpreters, and you have to see that interpreters are, I see them as, they're not clinicians, but they are colleagues. So if you want to control an interaction with interpreters, you'll be unhappy for life because it's a very, very, very unpleasant venture. But if you work in a triangle, so if you work with interpreter as a colleague to help you unfold the meaning, what is interesting is that family will talk and say to the interpreters things that they won't necessarily tell you. So very often I meet with interpreter before the meeting. I tell them, look, I'd like to know what the family thinks the problem is. I like to think, where do the family think the problem come from? If ever you engage, so I'll ask a question about that. Don't hesitate to pursue the conversation in Spanish, in Somali, I do speak Spanish, so that's not a problem, but in Hindi, in Urdu, whatever. and come back to me after. And then you get the nonverbal. So the whole idea is really creating a collaborative relation with the interpreter. And maybe just a last point about that. We speak a lot about bilingual family, but be careful. A lot of the family I work with in Parkex, in fact, are multilingual. And you need to do a language history before coming in, or when you come in. So and the family in Parkex may present as Tamil, so parents speak Tamil, but mom watched films in Hindi. The kids are exposed to Hindi all the time. Kids speak among themselves in English. The little one go to French school, and the toddler go to a Greek French daycare. So having multiple language is now increasingly common for family and becomes a challenge.
Dr. Cécile, this has been an absolutely invigorating session. A lot of great information, very comprehensive. We appreciate so much what you've done for us today. Can you, before you take us out, explain this image that we're looking at right now and what does it represent for you?
Yes, I will leave it with you. It's an art piece was done at the US-Mexican border. And I think it's an amazing way, an innovative way to represent the borders among mankind. And they are political, they are racial, they are ethnic, they are cultural. And it's this interesting and tender gaze of the little child looking at the border, which I thought was a powerful message toward reconciliation.
Thank you so much. And thank you for being here today. Thank you all for participating today in this session. Also, stay in touch with us by liking us and participating in our social media. Go to our web pages. There are QR codes for all of these. We'll follow up with you again in another week or so, as we promised before. So all of the information from all of these great sessions, 1 through 4, will be eventually uploaded on our site. You'll be able to access them. We've just been really edified by this whole experience of doing cultural formulation. So we hope that it's been value added for you, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Take good care. Have a wonderful day.